finally, a source of raw, real, and honest information on healthcare issues that matter most. Welcome to BS Free MD. From the latest medical information to how to stay sane as a doctor or a patient, no subject is taboo, no BS is allowed. Now, let's welcome your hosts, Doctors May and Tim Hindmarsh.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of BS Free MD. And today's conversation is for anyone staring down a future they didn't ask for, didn't expect, or flat out dread. The feeling, and I've been there myself, when life shifts under your feet and you're left wondering how you'll ever find your footing again. So not only is this podcast episode perfect for me, we've been talking about this topic a little bit lately: burnout, transition, etc. And so with us today is Dr. Rebecca Sutherns, and she's here to help us tackle this topic head on. And she's an author, strategist, entrepreneur, and transitions coach who helps high-achieving women navigate the hardest shifts in life: career changes, empty nests, relationships, you name it. Her superpower? That's helping people not only face their futures, but learn to love them. So if you're struggling with this and with what's, going to happen next, this one's going to really hit home for you. So welcome, Rebecca, to BS Free MD. We're so happy to have you here.
Thanks very much. It's good to be here. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Of course, we always have to throw out, we won't give away your secret location there in your beautiful wooden bunker, but she is a fellow Canadian, so hats off to you up there in the Great White North.
Yeah, a little whiter this year. I understand.
Yes. I live in a renovated church, and so where you're finding me is in the attic, or what would have been the attic of the church, hence all the wood in the background.
That is really cool.
That could be. I haven't seen the whole inside, but that could be a really cool, eclectic home. So awesome. Let's start here. Tell us a little bit about your background, and have you always been a life coach? How did you get there, and where did you come from?
No problem. The quick answer is no, I haven't. But as someone who has raised 4 people who are now in their 20s, there's a certain amount of life coaching that's gone on in the last 28 years of parenting. But professionally, I started my career in international development and gradually transitioned into more of a consulting space across mission-driven organizations. And so probably 2/3 of my work right now is strategy development with mission-driven organizations or coalitions of organizations who are looking to figure out what their organizational next chapter needs to look like. And so I'm good at helping groups of people move together toward an objective and get some clarity around next steps for them. And so it wasn't a huge leap for the leaders and board chairs of those organizations to seek me out, more of a one-on-one situation, to begin talking about kind of their own personal strategic plans, if I can put it that way. Really thinking about what their personal next chapter would look like, particularly those who have been in really values-driven, mission-driven organizations, really identifying strongly with the purpose of their work and therefore the purpose of their own lives. And so the one-on-one coaching and also now group experiences of coaching were a fairly logical extension of that. And so that's where my paid work has me sitting. And it's always been really strongly intertwined with, I mentioned my parenting roles with 4 kids and now with 2 grandkids as well. And so there's a lot of kind of personal lived experience of this that mirrors what's going on inside my practice.
Yeah, perfectly said. As a parent, you are always life coaching, even as they're adult children. We know that too. But tell us a little bit about this life change coaching. So for some people still, I don't think know what coaches do. So I like to always just clarify that, do the little housekeeping for a second, and that you're not a psychiatrist or psychologist. Well, I don't know if you have a psychology background, but coaching is a little different than sitting down with your pastor or your psychiatrist. So can you explain a little bit how the coaching works?
Sure. In its purest sense, coaching is a space where It is different from therapy. It's different from being a chaplain or a psychotherapist or something like that. But it has some similarities in the sense that it's very question-based. And it's a task where the coach creates a space that is confidential and safe enough that they can ask some probing questions and help the client discover insights and just really being well listened to so that the person can talk things through. So I think of it as being almost like a thinking partner and someone who can mirror back what they're hearing and keep someone company as they untangle things. I would say that there's a big range of, just like there would be with any kind of other helping profession, what I've described is the generic description. And then you start getting into the fit and chemistry and temperament of the individual coach and the match between the coach and the client, to say sometimes it's a bit more maybe pointed or directed, and other times it's a little more quiet and passive and lots of kind of just nodding and listening. But I also am part of something called Thought Leaders Business School, which is in some ways almost the antithesis of coaching, in the sense that pure coaching involves zero advice giving. Maybe a little different than, say, mentoring, when you're helping someone who is explicitly wanting to follow in your footsteps. Coaching is not that. And yet in the thought leader space, you're positioned as someone who knows something about something, is bringing some expertise into the space. And so I straddle those two worlds because I know some things about the pure sort of coaching methodology, but I also know some content related things about transition, and also some group activities and group expertise, because sometimes I find that people learn best in groups, not just teams that they're on, but sometimes it's semi-random groups that we pull together for these experiences where everyone's working on their own thing, but they're doing it in the company of others. And so I bring a combination of thought leadership and facilitation expertise to my coaching. And it's an interesting blend. And I try to be as explicit as I can be with my clients about what they're getting themselves into.
That's fascinating. Yeah. Most people have heard of coaching now. Everyone's heard of the coach for the sports teams, fitness coach, trainer. But in the personal coaching space, it's so vast. And I think some people still think it's psychology based, but the amount of input varies. You're right, from sitting back and helping people along to mentoring or almost a friend type of it.
Yeah, but it's interesting because I don't know, I wrote an article a week or two ago, and the bottom line was challenging assumptions and asking questions. And there's a large part where I really believe the quality of your life is the quality of the questions you ask. Because it's not, somebody can give you the answer, but the journey of asking a question, challenging an assumption, and then figuring out, okay, this is what we need to do. That's the thing. I remember right when I started my career, one of my colleagues that was really mentoring me was in leadership. And he said, most of leadership isn't what decision you make, it's how you make it and who gets to be part of it. And it's really true, because there's so many decisions you can make that it doesn't necessarily matter. There's lots of good options, but how you get to those options is the critical part. Do you have buy-in? Are people owning that? All of those kind of things.
Yeah. And that's equally true. The reason I love working both with individuals and organizations is I think what you just described, Tim, is exactly true. That the process by which I come to an individual decision, and including its alignment with my values and how explicit I am about what's important to me and how I came to that decision, that is all going to affect the traction or friction in a good way that decision gets. And same thing in a group. We know that if people buy into the process of decision making, they are much more likely to go along with the decision. Even, interestingly, when that decision affects them negatively, they will still come alongside and buy in and implement that decision much more willingly if they feel like there was integrity and transparency to the decision-making process itself. And so I really love helping decision-making processes become more explicit, and asking people how they want to decide something before deciding it. And that's true in groups and organizations, and it's also true in my individual coaching.
You're perfect for me because I'm a Libra and I cannot decide.
Me too, but I don't know if that really matters. But I get that. That's
Anyway.
Oh boy, is that true.
You are, as you said, doing the individual coaching. So it's mostly female focused, correct? Helping women.
Yeah. It tends to be. It's funny. I don't market it that way necessarily all that often, but that tends to be who gravitates to this work. So I don't want to be exclusive in that space.
Right.
And yet sometimes I am, and sometimes it just happens by default.
Yeah, I know that. I mean, in my career, I called myself the psycho gynecologist because I ended up seeing, almost 85 to 90% females and doing gynae. And this just becomes who you're working with. So that just happens. So let's get into the nitty gritty of, man, what's happening with, I'll just say women specifically. We can include you guys too, but in this big sense of this big change of life, this dread that when change is happening, like why? Can you explain, first of all, why it's so scary? I don't know how we navigate change, even though whether it's your kids all leaving home and now you're the empty nester, or it's like you're burned out of your career and you have to pull the plug, but you're like, I don't know where to begin. Like, what? I don't know. What's the thinking behind that, and what are the steps to go forward? Yeah.
There's a lot there, but I think, first of all, it's not a linear thing, and it's also not a rational thing. And so I think if we can help people set expectations that set aside both of those ideas, it'll go better. So if we're expecting things to proceed according to a preset sequence of steps, we will probably be shocked when it is messier than that. And also, as many of us know from navigating grief, for example, we expect it to take a certain length of time. And if it takes more or less than that, there's a certain resistance in us of that. And we come into transitions with some sort of expectation of pace that is usually wrong. And so I've really appreciated the work of people like Bruce Feiler, for example. He's done some work on something he calls life quakes. And he says that these massive disruptive transitions in our lives, A, they happen much more often than we think. And B, they take longer to navigate than we think, usually an average of ballpark 5 years. And so if you think about a change season taking 5 years, for those of us especially who move through life quickly, high achievers, used to getting stuff done, 5 years feels like a really long time. You want to master the curriculum before that. And so if we can set some expectations of a longer time frame and a messier experience, we don't feel quite as alone, as untethered, as ridiculous as we sometimes feel. And I think the other piece of it, if I can put it into stages, there's an ending of something usually. There's a letting go of something. And so there's a grief and a whole soup of other emotions around that. There's this messy middle of feeling really at loose ends. And we can sometimes not even have words for that. It's this weird kind of in-between liminal space where we might be on the threshold of something, but we may not yet be. And our brains really don't like that. They don't like that level of uncertainty. So we're often trying to find an anchor point that is just not there. And then you're embarking on something new, potentially, that also has its own fears and uncertainties associated with that. And then you've usually got more than one of those going on at a time in any given adult life.
Right.
So it is a bit messy, but if we can kind of name and put some language to what we're going through, I find that people do a bit better because we need some scaffolding to hang some things on and go, okay, I've got to create some structure to this, because otherwise it does feel like I'm literally in a swamp of change and I just don't know what forward motion feels like or looks like or requires me to do. And so part of the coaching benefit is creating almost like containers for conversations where we go, okay, let's unpack this piece now and then this piece later. And it gives a bit of shape to something that feels really foggy.
Can you relate to that?
Yes, completely.
Right.
Maybe all of it. I'm just thinking in my head. So there's what you're saying about how you're right. Things don't happen in a box. So it's not, oh, there's this career change coming up or happened, and therefore it's going to take 5 years to get through that. So I'll focus on that. Meanwhile, life keeps happening, and then something else happens, which is can be a change, positive or negative, that you're having to deal with, and something else or a health thing. And yeah, I mean, so many of these things overlap that and affect one another that I think sometimes people can get, you're right, it's a tornado swirl of thoughts and emotions and overwhelm. And we think that it should be happening quicker than it is and get frustrated when it's not, or compare yourself to others. And then you're, I think, circling the drain of despair, not knowing which way to go. And so having that structure, I think, is very helpful. How often do you find when you're helping someone, thinking right away that some of the stuff that they're dealing with needs to be discussed with, say, a psychiatrist or psychologist, because there's so much back baggage that they can't get through to get forward?
Yeah. Part of it is really, obviously, as you would know from medicine too, making sure that you have a really clear sense of your own scope of practice and when we are outside of that scope, right? And that's true for any of us and,
Right.
and any kinds of referrals. And so I would think that this is like that, right? Where we go, all right, some of this needs to be dealt with in therapy in more of a clinical setting. And just similarly, some of it might need to be dealt with your best girlfriend and not with someone you're paying to have this conversation, right? There's a range of sort of referrals that we need to stay in our lane appropriately. And for me, I find scoping that out at the beginning and checking in as we go becomes quite important, because there are a lot of coaches out there and there's a lot of range of quality of coaches out there. And I think it's very important that people, coaches themselves and the clients they work with, have an understanding of what piece of the story sits with whom, just like we're looking for a bunch of people on our physical care team. And you need to understand if you're going to your medical doctor or your chiropractor or your nutritionist for something, it's the same thing with this. And I think of the kind of work I'm doing is really bringing some clarity to people and structuring some conversations so that they don't feel that things are quite as foggy. But certainly if we're dealing with more significant mental health challenges, for example, or things that seem to require clinical-based therapy, I need to be skilled enough to make those referrals as required.
I was just wondering how often you say, okay, in conjunction with what you're doing, say, I really want you to talk to a psychologist about this part, because that's just like a lot of childhood baggage that you need to resolve in order to move forward. Or maybe someone needs to, I don't know, talk to a pastor or a minister about this moral dilemma you're dealing with. And so I was just trying to let people know that
I think that's all those things are possible, right? And I think that I find that people who reach out to a coach, I'm overgeneralizing, but they tend to be people who know how to reach out for help to a variety of people, right? And so often they are people that are either seeing a therapist or have in their past or have a circle of support in other ways. Not everybody, but I do find that they're usually pretty skilled at seeing that. And certainly if there's a lot of, you mentioned dealing with baggage from a past, I do find coaches tend to be fairly future oriented. And so part of my training is helping people look ahead. And if I'm finding that someone is really anchored to a lot of past trauma, that's usually one signal that I might not be the right or only person to be having conversations with them right now.
Yeah. So let's talk about how you walk through your program. You have I've read the elastic method to help people through transitions. Can you walk us through what that is, what that means, what it stands for, and how you use that?
Yeah, absolutely. So in 2023, I wrote a book called Elastic, and the subtitle is Stretching Without Snapping or Snapping Back. And the idea is a metaphor. I find metaphors are helpful to people in terms of testing out sort of the edges of their experience and comparing it with something. But I think if I think about the metaphor of, say, a rubber band, an elastic band, if it's sitting on your desk, it's not doing anything. It is not fulfilling the purpose for which it is intended. Even if that purpose is holding together broccoli, it is not doing anything, right? And if it's been sitting there doing literally nothing for any length of time and you go to use it, it's often brittle and it can't stretch anymore the way it's supposed to. So I think that we as humans need to stretch appropriately. But if we've stretched for too long in one position or we have stretched too suddenly, we obviously know that rubber band can snap or it can lose its stretchiness. But similarly, maybe unlike a rubber band that does go back to its original shape, there's times in our own lives as humans where we're being asked to go back to shapes that no longer fit us. For me, that really came into sharp focus post-pandemic when people were being invited or expected to go back to a work situation that no longer fit them, having now experienced what it was like not to do that for a long period of time. So the book and sort of part of my method around the metaphor of elastic has to do with helping people use some of those labels of where they feel appropriately stretched versus overstretched or understretched to give them some pictures of where in their lives they are feeling good about where they are and where they need to stretch a little more or less. And also it tends to be cumulative. So just like with a rubber band, you can stretch it a little bit, but if you also start trying to stretch it in many directions at once, we're dealing with that across all the domains of our lives. And so I'm someone who can maintain a bunch of storylines all at the same time. And I think that's what our lives are like. So on one level, Elastic is really about that. But on the other hand, it also, or in addition to that, it is also an acronym for some leadership qualities, one per letter of that word, that really describe the kinds of people, and in my case, leaders, that are demonstrating some characteristics that help them lean into that kind of appropriate stretchiness. And if we can incorporate some of those skills, because they're all learnable skills, they're not a you're born like this or you're not. It's very much a learnable thing. So paying attention, I'll just run through them quickly. We can dig in anywhere you like. But the E is for energy, and it's a real currency for people. If your energy is low, that's usually a proxy for something else going on. So energy, likability, adaptability, strategy, trust, imagination, and curiosity. And the areas that I'm really interested in now, a couple of years after, or 18 months after writing the book, have really taken me into that imagination and curiosity end of things. I've done quite a bit of work in the adaptability space as well. And as I mentioned, my main work is in strategy. So I find myself skating across all 7 of those areas. But in the kind of work we were just talking about in the coaching space, I think helping people imagine a desired future or multiple desired futures is part of what can begin to make that future more attractive and less something that you're dreading and more something that you're actually looking forward to. Because if we can describe a future we want, we are much more likely to move toward it, much more likely to be motivated to move toward it. And I think part of what I see in my practice is that when we are swimming in that soup of untethered in-betweenness, we can't even describe what getting out of it would look like or what the next thing that we'd like to move toward is. And so if I can help people even name what they want, that can actually be quite a valuable contribution to the journey that they're on.
Oh, so many thoughts. So first of all, you and I must have a brain working in tandem, because I've said throughout the years, I just talking to women, living my life, career, balancing, that I said that it is really, you're like an elastic human being. It's the whole thing of, oh, women can have it all and do it all. I'm like, it's impossible, because literally you're being pulled one direction by your kids, or you're another direction by your career or your spouse or your hobbies or your other family or health issues. And you can only stretch so much in one direction or all directions, and the elastic's going to snap. And I like your analogy though about how if it's just laying there, it's going to get stiff and unused and not even have any purpose. So well said. And then the whole thing of, I think, but that's really where you start with people, right? Is trying to even imagine that, create like what would be their vision for their next phase in life. And how many people do you think really get stuck there? I know personally for me, I'm just
Yeah.
is that working now?
Yeah, you're back. I lost you, but now I'm back. You're back.
Time we've never had that happen.
I've never had. Yeah, I just white it out. It said something happened and it's not your fault. Oh.
There you go. At least we're reassured that you're good.
Write down, hang on one second. I just got to write down.
How many minutes that was?
Yeah, it was like 25, 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll segue back into going. So, yeah, I was thinking, how I'm thinking that for many career women, but maybe not all, gosh, it could be someone that's been a homemaker their entire life raising kids who's not really dedicated much time to hobbies for their own personal interests, or someone who's been so engrossed in a career that they haven't had time to even think about themselves. Then they're looking suddenly at a new phase of life and it's, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to imagine what's important to me. Is that pretty common? Is that more than not? Or is it a 50-50 thing? And how do you start with women to even begin imagining?
The people that come to me are people who are experiencing what you just described. And so I can't speak to the,
right.
It's very common in my world.
Okay.
But exactly what you're saying is true. And I think maybe just to bring in a little bit of my own story here, I think I thought that kind of struggle would befall people who were one-dimensional, who had really over-invested, over-indexed on their career, or over-indexed on their family responsibilities, and didn't have a lot else going on. So when that one big thing disappears for whatever reason, chosen or not, they're a bit lost, right? And my own experience and that of many of the women I work with is that you can have a very rich, diverse, varied set of involvements, including all the areas of life that you've mentioned. Working for pay, raising children, involved with friends and family and hobbies and all the things, and still find that when one significant piece of that goes away or transitions into something else, it can really shake you. And I think for me and others I've talked to, that's almost more surprising because you think you've got a pretty diverse portfolio, right? And yet you can still be quite shaken by it. And I think also, I know going through it when my kids were leaving, for example, again, I think it's about expectations, but I almost didn't want to talk about it because I felt like such a cliche. I just felt like so many people go through this. It's not really that interesting. Why am I finding this such a challenge when I knew it was coming? It's all good news. Like, I would rather my kids grow up and become successful adults and aren't all playing video games in my basement. This is good news. And I think the blend of emotions is really surprising for people, at least it was for me, in terms of this is a good news story. It's what we're going after. Lots of people go through it. And I have lots of other things going on in my life that are meaningful and interesting. And this is super hard. And I think having a space where you can actually acknowledge that was useful for me and is also very useful for my clients because the emotions associated with it can be quite complicated and a bit surprising, even for people that have shored up a lot of other things in their lives. And for me, one of the distinguishing sort of determinants of that has to do with meaning. And so, for example, as my children were leaving, I had always seen my parenting role as my most meaningful piece of a very, busy, diverse mix of things I do. Parenting was always the most important to me in those years. And when that piece started to transition out, I was grieving that, but I was also going, what's going to measure up to that on the meaning scale? So it wasn't like I couldn't think of anything to fill my time with, but I wanted to do way better than fill my time. And that set of relationships just seemed to trump everything else. And so when I was grieving that process, I was also overlaying that with the idea that it was taking longer than I thought. And I remember, we always laugh about this now, but I remember once our oldest child moved away to school, I remember just feeling really quite destabilized by that and saying to my husband, I will be okay when they're all gone, but I either want them all home or all gone. I don't like this in-between thing. And the in-between thing was like 9 years. Like, it was a long time for us. And I don't think people really talk about the gradually emptying nest, or for some people, the kids that return and leave and return and leave. And so you're expecting as a parent to be super adaptable. And we jokingly say we never really know who's going to be home for what meals because we have some that do live near here still. And do I need food in the fridge for everybody or not? Like, it can be something as basic and mundane as that. And yet it can take on the symbolic importance going, I don't know how many people I'm looking after right now. And I don't know if that's going to be for good or not. And certainly my experience now that everyone is launched is that it is easier having nobody at home or everybody at home, but I had to navigate 9 years of that in-between stage. And I think the level of flexibility and adaptability that parents are expected to have without really ever talking about it all that much. Like, I don't remember sitting down and negotiating this with any of our children going, hang on, who's here when, who's moving out when, who's moving in when, all that stuff. It's just you're expected to just be consistent setting. And for many of us, that's a little bit like what parenting teenagers is like, where you're available but not needed, and you might be needed. And if you are needed, you're needed badly and at a moment's notice, but there's a lot of hours where you're actually not, and in fact, not wanted. And so you're trying to figure out your role. And I don't know if you guys ever did that sort of like double Dutch skipping thing, but it makes me think about where you're trying to find your moment where you go in and not. And I just felt like I had a lot of years where I was like, is it now? Is it now? Can I do this now? And so you've got this weird timing thing and need thing overlaid with that larger meaning and purpose piece. And it can get, it's not tragic. There's no pity party required here, but there is a lot to navigate. And I think if we can create spaces for people to have some conversations about that and acknowledge the complexity of what they're going through, and usually across multiple domains, right? Because as you said, you might be also caregiving for older parents or dealing with health diagnoses or other things that can destabilize the situation, that I just think having some places where we can name it and acknowledge that it's complicated is a helpful thing.
No, that's a really good point. And especially I was thinking as you're talking about that, yes, and now it seems to be things have shifted, since our generation. Everybody wanted to get out of the house. You would go to college or university or get a job and get out. And now, because of the cost of living, various other factors, kids are moving back home again. And I think that is something that I don't think people really thought through that emotionally, how it's, oh, now am I a parent, but I'm not because this is an adult child, and how much do I parent them, and how much even that alone, right?
Yeah.
The other thing I thought of is all change to a certain degree is loss. I've even read the essays by people that lost a ton of weight. They lost 100 pounds. And they still, the smart ones understand that they actually gave something up. Okay. They wouldn't trade back. They like their new life. They're healthier. They can do all these things they couldn't do. But you lost something. You lost the ability to eat whatever you wanted, whenever you wanted. Yep. You lost, this one woman talked about how when she'd roll over in bed, she was so bony now that she was more uncomfortable sometimes sleeping. And it sounds crazy, but it's really powerful for people to understand. Change is loss, and loss needs to be grieved. And I think what happens is there's lots of stuff that happens in our lives that we don't really recognize as necessarily a loss. Mm-hmm. And it goes ungrieved or acknowledged even, and then it becomes the thing that it was never intended to become.
Yes. Yeah. I really think that's true. And I think the other piece of it is that we have this narrative that we might not even realize we have until it's breached in some ways. And that is that change is sometimes, right? That you go through a period of change and then, things will get back to normal in some way. And we may not even say that out loud, but sometimes we actually keep your head down until the dust settles. And once things get back to normal, it will be fine. And, no big surprise, even as people hear me say it out loud, but there is no going back to normal because change is the norm. Like when we actually look at the different transitions that all of us are experiencing in the world, much less in our lives and in our sectors and whatever other arenas we're working in, I think it's partly a mindset and expectations thing of saying, if you're waiting for things to either slow down or get back to normal, you're going to be disappointed because we have to learn how to surf the waves of change, not expect the seas to get calm. And so if we can, I feel like the sooner that some of the folks I work with can get their heads around that, the more easily they can find their way through to whatever a more inspiring future looks like. And interestingly, when we look at the behavioral science and data science on adaptability, one of the strongest predictors of somebody's happiness with adapting, we all adapt. Some of us just do it kicking and screaming, right? Yeah. But if you're figuring it out in a healthy, energized kind of way, one of the biggest predictors is hope. And hope isn't just like Pollyanna optimism. It's also, I can see a positive future I can see multiple pathways to get there. So there's a mental flexibility in that. And I have the motivation or the agency or the resources to move along at least one of those pathways to get to that positive future. So hope has all kinds of juicy stuff with it that isn't just rainbows and unicorns. But the more we have that sense of that positive future that we can move toward, and the more vivid our picture is of it, the more likely we are to be energized by the journey to get there. And I find when people are right in the midst of one or many transitions, it's foggy. People describe it as foggy. And so they don't have clarity about where they're trying to go. And therefore, it's really hard to move toward it. And that's where I think that imagination piece becomes really important, because the more vividly we can fill in the details and the color and the shading and all the descriptors of what that possible next chapter looks like, the more energized we'll be by it, the more likely we are to move toward it. But if it just feels foggy, we're not going to be motivated to make progress, because we don't even know what making progress is.
Right. I was just thinking it myself personally, but like we talked about, when someone has gone through a lot of changes at once, that sometimes, and those are very much things that have to be grieved, right? Because they're unwanted changes, or there can be personal loss, whether it's divorce or death or firing from a job or unwanted move or financial, all these things. And so how do you walk someone through looking for hope? It's like, that's where you want to start, is like you need a piece to go forward with. But when they're stuck in like that fog of, oh my gosh, all this, or even a couple things, even one big thing happened, and I need to try to grieve that, but yet I'm supposed to be looking forward to this hope and this plan. But yet it's almost like a seesaw of 1 minute my brain's here, but yet I'm supposed to be happy and hopeful for this. So how do you navigate that?
Yeah. Yep. I think that is what you've described is the mess of it, right? And part of it is being gentle enough on ourselves to recognize that it is often in that both andness of things that we have to find those moments or those people or those settings where we can let our guard down a bit and both grieve what's dying and or tentatively sketch out what some possible ways forward could be when they're just in a really germinating kind of phase and you don't actually want to put them out in the world yet. And so I think creating some brave and or safe spaces for that can help us. I also think being gentle on our timing. I mentioned the pace of things. I think when something is really fresh, it's very hard at that point to look ahead. And so encouraging someone to move toward a positive future, if some traumatic thing has just happened, can feel like toxic positivity. When I think the other thing is like normalizing the experience, because sometimes the big changes we go through are unwanted. Sometimes they're wanted. Mm-hmm. And yet they're still grief worthy. And I think that really surprises people, that I chose to leave that job or leave that marriage or leave that city, and yet I'm still bereft. Did I make the wrong decision? Is my emotional reaction to this the appropriate barometer of the wisdom of my decision or not? And so I think helping people figure out the emotional landscape of that is pretty important, because especially in those really early days, it's probably not the time to be pushing toward that future. But sometimes in the coaching world, we call it glimmers. When you're in a conversation with someone and they just mention a thing that changes their energy or makes their eyes light up just for a moment, and you go, like, I wonder if when they're ready, that little love that they just hinted at will begin to blossom in them, because we have very quirky, specific things that each of us loves, that we're energized by, that light us up. And I think when we are in deep grief or lostness of some sort, we lose that light a little bit. And when we rekindle just even a tiny flicker of it, if you have somebody in your life, or hopefully more than one person in your life, that can see it and go, follow that for a bit, then it's like a flashlight that lights up the next couple steps in front of you, not just the next one. And all of a sudden years later sometimes, look back and go, oh yeah, I started coming back to life. And I think to be really specific about it, I remember when I was much younger, we went through a pregnancy loss quite late in pregnancy. And I remember people calling me and being so, supportive and trying to be so helpful and telling me all of their pregnancy loss stories. And I remember thinking, I don't want to be part of your club, actually. And a lot of the transitions in midlife we go through are like that too, where what they are saying might be very true and probably ultimately helpful at some stage. But at certain stages, it is not helpful because we are so resistant to enjoying whatever comes on the other side of this, because we are really still very much in the grieving of what's been lost, and that we need to be able to sit there. And I think it takes discernment on the part of those that love us to help us nudge forward at the appropriate time without it being too soon, or without expecting it, as I mentioned at the beginning, for it to be linear or tidy or following a particular time scale. So I think some really good listening and good discerning friends can be very helpful at that, to discern when we need to sit in that and just be with those hard emotions, and when it might be time to notice those glimmers and reflect them back to the person.
I think this is particularly difficult for experts.
Yeah, I can see that. More about that too.
We are, whether we think so or not, we're at least treated by society as experts. And then you become an expert at it. Like, you actually become an expert. And it's not very hard. Like, for me to go to work it's not that hard. And that's why I love sort of the metaphors of learning other activities. I started kiteboarding a year or so ago, and it is brutal. Like, it is literally like being thrown off of a building and waterboarded at the same time. And I've learned tons of action sports. It's got tens of thousands of hours of windsurfing and skydiving and all this stuff. And it just hit me. Everything sucks until it doesn't. Everything you're going to learning medicine was brutally impossibly hard until it wasn't. Learning to play guitar is literally physically painful until it's not. And when you're an expert and you've been an expert for decades, you forget that. If I go skiing, I don't think about it. I've been skiing for 52 years. You learn a new thing. And so this refreshing of your experiences, we see a lot of pickleball injuries. So people our age, learn to do that, learn to play. Like, it's super refreshing because it reminds you that all of these other changes and all of these other things in life, you're going to have to learn how to do it. Like, guess what? You look forward at your entire career to be retired. You're going to have to learn how to be retired. Yeah. And it's going to suck until it doesn't. And I think that's really difficult for people to understand, because you have to, especially for men, you got to retire to something, not away from something, or else you might as well just put you in the box, because statistically you're going to die in the next 6 months.
Yeah, it's true. And certain kinds of activities, let's take the retirement example. Lots of people retire and are excited to finally have time to do all the things that they haven't had time to do, right? So they take up their hobbies, and where I live, they enroll in a couple hockey games a week, and they do all those things, but they've lost something too that is actually hard to replicate. And I have a friend that says, I don't have empty nest problems, I have empty inbox problems. And I had somebody else who was an active CEO, and he said, nobody asks my opinion about anything anymore. When you spend 30 years being seen as one of the smartest people in the room, and you lose something even as you gain something. And I love what you're saying about remembering that when we're a beginner at something, it's terrible, right? And so when we have put a certain number of miles under the hood, we haven't been beginners at things for a long time, and we forget how awkward we are. And I think that idea, when I mentioned curiosity earlier, I think having that learner mindset and being willing to be a rookie at something and remember how awful it feels is actually a really good way to approach this. My husband and I decided that in the years in between when our kids left and when they actually settled where they were going to be, so most of them have been doing post-secondary school and we don't know where they'll land, we decided to really treat it as an experimental kind of phase. And I feel like for me, that language has helped me hold some things loosely. So we're trying stuff. We're working remotely a few different months of the year from different places and giving that a try. Or we had an international student come and live with us and we tried that. And she just moved out recently, and different things where I haven't felt like I have to know what's going to work or what's going to work forever. But for right now, what could we try? And in fact, that in between liminal sort of space of transition, we know from research that it's actually a super creative time. So it's a really good time for somebody to enroll in like an 8-week course in something. You don't have to become the world expert at it. You don't have to use it to pay your bills. You can just try it. And if you are terrible at it, great. And if you're not, so much the better. But just having a real lightness to it, I think sometimes we can get a bit broody and a bit overly serious about this. And I've found injecting a bit of lightness and experimentation in it really helps, as does remembering that because we're adults, we have a lot of fodder from which to imagine and be curious. Because in fact, when we imagine new futures or get curious about things, it's based on our memory, actually. The neuroscience of this is super interesting. And we draw on what we know to extend into areas we don't know. I was interested in what you just said, Tim, about I know windsurfing and skydiving, now I'm trying kiteboarding. It's like that, right? You've got some experience and therefore you're doing something sort of similar, a little bit adjacent to it, but I'm going to extend it into another place. That's amazing for adults because many of us have this storehouse of experiences on which to draw. So we have all kinds of we have more edges to stretch from, if I can put it that way, than we do if we've had a very small life. And
Right.
Thankfully for those folks that don't have the same privilege as others of being able to travel the world, for example, or try different things, we can get there almost vicariously through things like reading or experiencing movies and things like that expose us to new types of things. Because if you've never heard of Paris, you're not going to be curious what Paris is like because you don't have any vocabulary or image in your head to anchor that idea to, from which to then springboard into new ideas. So I think that adults, as much as we might think that imagination and curiosity are childhood things, my crusade at the moment is that imagination is something we grow into, not out of. And we have a lot of reason to be very optimistic that adults can get really good at that.
That suddenly made me think of my childhood when you were talking about just trying new things for the sake of whether it works out or not.
Are you going back to Ukrainian dancing?
Yeah, maybe. Like when I was a kid, I surfed from one activity to the next. And that was, for a while, I felt like I was the jack of all trades and activities, master of none. But it was amazing because I did the Ukrainian dancing with my friend down the street. I did ballet. I did all kinds of dance. I did figure skating. I did all kinds of sports and music and dabbled in. I'd be like, I don't really like this. And my mom would go, okay, whatever, switch to try something else. So I never really thought of it as an adult because I think as adults, then I just have to have this thing, or some of us that are perfectionists think I got to do this and master it. And if it doesn't work out, crap, I spent this money on this course, or I didn't learn Spanish. So now what? Instead of using it as an experiment to find out if it works, great. If it doesn't, even better, because it's like, that wasn't your thing. But you got to start somewhere. But that childlike attitude really is so powerful.
But you have to be willing to suck at it.
Yes.
Which has been really hard.
That's a whole
that is a hard thing
discussion
for Enneagram 1s to accept.
I don't know how much you know about Enneagram.
I get it.
Use it at all, but
yeah, I do. And I'm an Enneagram 7. So for me, life is a buffet, right? So it's all about the both and-ness and try it all. But it's absolutely true that you have to be willing to be a beginner. And for those of us that are, as you said, Tim, experts at things and or high achievers who like getting the gold star or whatever that looks like, it's really hard to go back to being at the bottom of the class, right? Because probably it's a place we've never actually been and never really wanted to be, and took great pride in the fact that we weren't. So there's identity pieces tied up in that. And I love this
age.
idea.
How about age? I'm thinking this is ridiculous, but I'm like, I'm almost 60. What can I do? But then I look around the neighborhood and see all these amazing people that are in their 80s and have these lives that are so full. They're still doing whatever. So then I think, okay, well, I'm not there yet. But yet, on the other hand, I'm like, I'm 60. It's time to just give up. So
Are you
I
kidding?
Right.
Colonel Saturn started KFC when he was
Oh,
65.
right. It's true. And Becca, I don't know if you've seen Becca Levy's work, but she did some really interesting work on aging. And she found that our mindset toward aging actually affects our longevity by roughly 7 years. So if you have a positive outlook on getting older, you are likely to get older and live longer. And I have really had to continue to work at that, to say, do I believe, like, it's, to me, it's a belief thing, a mindset thing. Do I believe that the best is yet to come? Because if I don't believe that, and many days I don't, then we might be unconsciously thinking that our sort of glory days, our best years are behind us. And you live differently than if you actually believe that good things, better things even, are coming. And also, it's partly a math question. I think that we've been really ingrained in a 65-year working life. And right. And so if you're getting to be 60, that means you might be almost done. And it's, if we can revise that, particularly for those of us in privileged contexts, to say, actually, it's more like 100 years, not like 65. And so if I'm going to live to be 100, and we know that doing meaningful work for pay or not for pay is really healthy for us, chances are we're going to be contributing meaningfully for 80 years anyway. So then you go, okay, I have 20 years to do something. 20 years is a good long time. You could start a whole new thing in 20 years, right? You could start 5 new things in 20 years. I feel like getting our heads into the math of it helps those of us that aren't, where imagination might sound like a bit woo. This is actually pretty practical. Of, if you're going to live to 100 and you're going to stay healthy for the bulk of that, you've actually got time. And I look at people who retired in their early 50s, and some of them did get, as we were talking earlier, involved in service and a second or third or fourth career and really meaningful pursuits. And they went, oh my gosh, I had another 25 years of that. If I'd known in my early 50s that I was going to have 25 years of meaningful contribution left, I'm so glad that I did some of those things. Whereas other people who, I don't know, started playing golf and going out for lunch, 25, like, okay, but 25 years of that? Do I want it? I don't want to do that for 25 years, actually. I think the math of it has helped me lift my gaze a bit and also acknowledge the mindsets that sort of hold me back of what old is.
I think that is so important because, as I'm just thinking personally, but I think a lot of professionals that they've grown their nest egg and they see their friends around them retiring early, because that's the big push in medicine. What's an acronym? FIRE, financial independence, retire early. That's the big thing. Then it's okay, so you're retired, but to what? And does that mean golf? Or then you're right, or traveling?
No, all of that makes me crazy.
So you need,
because it does, because you sacrifice on a funeral pyre your young adulthood to become a physician.
Yeah.
And if you have a subspecialty, you're not starting until you're in your early to mid 30s. Okay. Yeah. So that's prime time for raising a family. Now you're building a career, and they're going to work for 10 years and live like absolute residents or interns for 10 years, so they never have to work again, so they can spend more time with their kids when their kids just start to hate them and turn 14. I look at the whole thing and I go, it's completely, what does it teach your kids? What does it teach your kids? Because part of parenting, the greatest thing we did in parenting is they watched us work hard. Yeah. Now our kids work hard. We have 2 kids that work really hard, and they're not scared of working hard, and they're not scared of working out, and they're not scared of going, because they saw that. My dad was an anesthesiologist for 10 years, and now he's 45, and I don't get it. It makes no sense to me.
I don't know how often you encounter that, but that was one of the things. And for me, and I think most people, yes, there has to be meaning other than hitting a golf ball or playing, passing the puck twice a week or that kind of a thing, and purpose. So I want to get this question. I want to get this question in before we run out of time. I was going to say,
if you're girded with something, I'm sorry.
That's where we're going.
Those things become super duper meaningful. Like when I was windsurfing a lot, it was super meaningful because I'd be delivering 3 babies that week and doing this other job that was really intense and really meaningful. And then when I did the other activities, it was like, yeah, they have a purpose. They unglue my mind so I could go back and do this other thing.
Yeah. So being the fact that you mentioned that you've taught or helped a lot of organizations that are doing missions work, how much then, I think I know the answer, but I'm just going to let you say, so how much with the one-on-one coaching that you do really has to focus on meaning, purpose, the spiritual aspect of what am I here for on earth to do other than hit
Yeah.
a golf ball?
Yeah. I think it's really important because I think if you're not wrestling with those meaning of life questions, then you start windsurfing for windsurfing's own sake, which in some ways is amazing. And I need to learn to get better at resting and playing and just doing things that are not achievement oriented. So I own that. But I do think for me that when I'm helping people or working through this in my own life, I'm doing it through the lens of what is important to them and what those meaningful things are. So for many people, that does have a spiritual root. It has an understanding of what have we been created to do. And I think about that from just a human level of where does love and social health fit into this. But I also think of it as from a very specific human level of saying we do have these very bespoke, customized, tailored, quirky things that we love. And I encourage people to figure that out. Some of Marcus Buckingham's work on love and work is about that, where if someone said, oh, I love horses, I would want to say, and this is where the questions matter, I think, Tim, is, oh, do you like riding them or breeding them? Oh, do you like riding them outdoors or indoors? Do you like white horses or black horses? It's your grandmother's horse that you like. And you start getting into, and as you get into the specificity of what they love, they light up and you go, do that. What are the things that are the very specific things that feel meaningful to us? And I think the other piece of that, not just meaning, but also belonging. And that sense of, we talk about physical health and you've both spent your life working in that field, physical health and mental health, but I think we're learning more and more about social health as well. And so for a lot of people, some of the transitions they're navigating at midlife result in a loss of community, a loss of belonging, a loss of social networks. So for example, as my children grew, many of the parents that I became close friends with were proximity friends. They happened to be the parents of the other kids on the soccer team, right? And as you don't have the soccer games anymore, do you not have those relationships anymore? And so there's some very good writing on the art and science of connection that's happening right now. And so some of the work that I'm involved in is helping people identify what they're craving. And for some people, it is craving that meaning, that the meaning and purpose. For other people, it's belonging. For other people, they're craving clarity because they're in that foggy place. Some are craving spaciousness. For many of us at this stage, we're just so packed full busy that they don't feel they have any breathing space to think about it. And one of the things that we'll put in the show notes today is just a little quiz that helps you identify and name some of what you might be craving at this stage. Because when we're in the middle of a change, we don't always have the words for what we want. And I remember I have a colleague named Lisa O'Neill in New Zealand, and she wrote a book called Everything You Want. And when I first saw it, it might have been about 5 years ago, I all of a sudden went, oh my goodness, I don't have a clue what I want. I know what I wanted, and that those big decisions made in your 20s have 25-year consequences in terms of career and kids and all that. But revisiting that idea of what do I want now, and even giving yourself permission to ask that question, because sometimes it can sound and feel off limits or self-indulgent or something like that. And I feel like it really isn't, because we need a sense of, what am I called to do and be in the world now? Like, who am I now? And I think
I was going to, if I can jump in right
yeah,
there,
dude.
because I was going to ask, and now you got to it, is I think for myself personally, and I don't know if I can speak to others, that sometimes there's this struggle though between what do I want and what would bring me joy versus I think that doesn't matter as much as where I've come from. And whatever your, say, moral beliefs are, or it's okay, I'll just throw myself as an example. I've been a physician with the privilege to help people for 30 years. It's a big deal to save lives and counsel them one-on-one. And that was very meaningful for all those levels. And now I'm like, if I was just to do something I want, I don't know, like blog about travel and just sit on a cruise ship and write my memoirs because that brings me joy. Well, I look at that and go, what kind of meaning is that? And so,
well, there's a tremendous amount of meaning because people are going to read that and like that. Like that.
So is that a struggle, or am I just a freak because I think I am? That people, it's like, how do you wrestle those spiritual, moral? purposeful things for the, versus this, how do I take what I love and want and make it have meaning?
Yeah. I am right there with you on that. I really, much longer conversation, but I feel like which piece of this do I want to talk about right now?
Yeah.
But I think that
But some people aren't alone if they're struggling with that.
absolutely not. Because for all kinds of reasons, we have been outward oriented, right? Oriented to other people. And so asking what we want can feel selfish.
Yes.
Or for me, what everybody else wanted always took precedence. And that wasn't a martyr thing on my part. That was by choice.
Right.
I created that. I fed into it. I was grateful for it. I loved that role. And I got to a place where I was like, that wasn't okay anymore. And it didn't have to be in a strident, self-promoting, selfish kind of way. But I think about it more in terms of I would put it in terms of my own sort of spiritual understanding. I would say, who have I been created to be in the world now? And in order for me to fulfill that, me being the person I was created to be when I was 25, as a 55-year-old, isn't that helpful. I have to figure out who I am as a 55-year-old. And I haven't taken 5 minutes to do that. And therefore, me figuring out what I want has to do with tapping into the gifts and the resources and the experiences, et cetera, that I have. Because I think sometimes when we gravitate towards something that we're really wired for, it feels so easy to us and so lovely and natural and like breathing and blinking that we go, that can't be that useful to other people. And yet other people are not wired that way. And they actually find us doing that to be super helpful because they hate what we love and we love what they hate and whatever. Right. So I'm working my way through that too. And we could certainly talk about it a lot longer, but I think there's a lot of good and bad baggage that we bring to that question. And it's a question I have been sitting with for the last few years and going, not just what do I want, but will I even give myself permission to ask the question?
And I think I'm just thinking back to the beginning of our conversation, maybe which puts a bow on it is that, like we said before, when you find what it is that lights you up, that gives you that glimmer when you're starting to imagine it, then your soul comes alive and everything pours into it, whatever that may be, if it might seem like a selfish thing at the beginning. And then you are free to give to everybody else and pour into their lives if you're actually doing something that lights up your soul. Even if you think, oh, this is a selfish thing, you come alive. There's somebody out there that's going to see that and be affected and touched by it. So I think that.
And we're harder on ourselves than we are on other people. And jump in and go, hang on, no, people would read that. And if I think about people who made amazing art, I don't think I would be going, what are we doing? What? Like, what a waste of your time. Why were you doing? We go, thank you for, nurturing that gift. Thank you. Like, your art has made my life more beautiful. And I appreciate that. And yet I'm sure there's many days for those artists that they're all angsty about that going, is this the best use of my time? So I feel like we're here to be, in a sense, fully self-expressed. And I don't mean that in a really selfish way. I mean it in a, like, what's the contribution that each of us has been put on the planet to fulfill? And I feel like there's not one answer to that. There are different answers that track partly with how old we are and what stage we're at and what we're bringing to the party now. And I think taking the time to get to know who we've become can be a very powerful way to enter into whatever next season we're heading into.
No, I think I love that. And I've tried to encourage May in this regard. I said, we have this toolkit that's so filled with tools and experience that it might take, again, some time to figure out exactly how to use those tools. There's way more, I believe at least, and maybe I'm wrong, we have way more to offer the world than just me going and seeing 40 patients in an urgent care a day. There was a time when that was great because it was newer and I was young and all that. But now we can share all of these experiences, talk to all these cool people. I don't know. I think that's far more valuable than just doing a task.
We're experts on how to resolve fights after 30 years.
We don't fight very often.
And where are we replaceable, right? I think about it that way. I go, like, for me, we didn't get into this today, but I became a grandmother 5 years ago, earlier than I expected, and resisted it in some ways. And yet now, 5 years in, I'm like, I am replaceable in almost every other job I do. But my grandbabies call me Minga, and I am not being good to anybody else. And that would matter to them if something happened to me or if I was not devoted to that role. And so that's put things in pretty sharp relief for me of, I think about you as an urgent care doc, Tim, and I go, that it feels impressive to me because I'm not that. But at the same time, I go, I think they could train other people to do that job. You're probably awesome at it, and you're not going to be
AI.
right? Yeah, I think people like hope it's people. I do think about where we are replaceable and where we're not. And I am not interchangeable with any other human. I would do my facilitation or my coaching differently, and you would care for your patients differently, both of you. But if they can't see us, they'll see another one. But who are the people? For me, at least, it's about who are the people for whom that's not true, where they go, no, if it's not you, that matters to me a lot. And that might be your patients for you. I don't want to discount that, but I think about it in terms of replaceability, right? And there's something about that as we get a bit older. And I think also we start to realize that we don't have that many turns left. And I don't mean to be morbid at all about that or rushing the game, but I go, it makes us zero in on what's really important to us. And that's why it has some urgency, not because the timeline is short, although it might be. It's more urgency because we realize the importance of using our time well, because we know that it's not infinite. And so there's this interesting interplay of we probably have longer than we think and shorter than we think. And I love living right in that paradox of that. And that's really where a lot of my clients find themselves.
Tension is what makes a parachute fly.
Yes.
If you don't have a weight at the end of that thing with your lines and it inflated and it under tension, it doesn't fly. It's a gigantic rock.
Mm-hmm.
And people forget that tension is critical. It makes things work in our life. So there has to be some, like in kiteboarding, it's unbelievable. Like you have to do all of these things. Like you go faster trying to resist the kite than you do if you go downwind, like straight downwind. Mm-hmm. And it's the same in any sailing. It's the resistance between the sail and the rudder or whatever you're edging against that actually gives it the forward drive.
Hmm.
It's fascinating. It's been true since we've had planing sailing ships. So however long that is.
Love that.
And there's so much more we could talk about,
Yes.
but I know your time's precious. You have to go. If we do this rapid fire fun segment, I got to throw one question at your
ready.
If there's one book, quote, or mantra that helps you love the life you're building, what would that be if you could think of something?
We're recording this at the holiday season, and I don't have them all within reach right now, but one of the things I'm putting in the mail for some people are a few of the little sayings that they tease me that I use a lot. So I realized I've used two of them already in this conversation. One of them is imagination is something you grow into, not out of. And another one is that version of me is no longer in print. So those are two of the stickers I had printed recently. But the other one I love, I'm hoping that this might look backwards on your screen. It's another sticker and it says, stay curious longer. And so I'm going to go with that one today, because I think sometimes when we are experts in something, we don't stay curious very long because we figure we know the answer. And so part of developing that beginner and rookie mindset is staying in the curiosity longer and learning how to live in that uncertain ickiness of not knowing something when we're used to being in certain environments. So that's my encouragement of myself and others today, is to stay curious longer.
Well,
perfectly said.
That is a perfect place to wrap up,
so,
because otherwise I'll keep talking and I will degrade the quality of the broadcast.
So I'm going to say, you want to share your resources and your website and podcast where people can find you?
Sure. It's just my name. So it's RebeccaSutherns.com. The only tricky part is to spell my last name right. So it's Sutherns. And if they go to that website /podcast, they'll find that quiz that I mentioned. We'll send you an e-copy of the book Elastic that I mentioned, and you'll find all kinds of other ways to get in touch with me if you want to. So thanks for that opportunity.
Perfect.
Absolutely.
All right. We will share the links, and everyone, please share this episode. I know that there will be someone in your life that has to hear it. All right, Rebecca, thank you so much for this amazing conversation. Insightful and so helpful.
Appreciate that. Thanks, May. Thanks, Tim. I appreciate the conversation too.
It's no secret that medicine is a bit uptight. That's why Tim and I created BS Free MD, to mix things up a little and have fun in the process. Besides, we are having these exact same discussions all the time, so we thought we might as well invite everyone to the party. If you really like us, you can get plenty more and maybe see one of Tim's cool tattoos on our Instagram or Facebook pages at BS3MD. See you next time.
But we try to keep BS3MD as raw and real as possible. We can't be held responsible for any medical decisions or discussions had as a result of what you've heard on the show. We know, bummer. But the truth is, we really do care about your questions. So feel free to reach out to us by email at doc@bs3md.com.